Verna Sedgwick, the county schoolteacher, stood at the general store counter in Ashwater with a printed prospectus open in her chapped hands. She read it twice. Then she said, plain as weather, that the Gulf Meridian shares were worthless paper. The men laughed her out into the road. She did not raise her voice. She never once raised her voice. The sales agent was a smiling man named Sherrod Pyle. 31 men were signing his book that afternoon. Pens scratching, money on the plank counter. Pyle looked at her over the crowd and he said it loud enough for all of them. Schoolteachers teach children their letters, ma'am. They don't read a grown man's ledger. And the whole store laughed with him. Every last one. But that night Verna sat alone at her lamp. She opened that same prospectus to a single page. She circled one number in pencil. She circled it twice. And she wrote a letter to Tallahassee, folded it small, and set it by the door to mail. I won't tell you yet what the letter said. If you believe a careful eye sees what a greedy crowd cannot, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe so you don't miss how far this one falls before it turns. And do me one thing. Comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. From that store counter in 1925 all the way to your kitchen table. Now, let me take you back to the start of it. And let me go slow, because the slow part is where you learn who this woman was. Ashwater was a small place in Tallahassee County, Florida, in the spring of 1925. You could walk the whole town in the time it takes to boil an egg. There was the general store with its long porch. There was the white church at the top of the rise. There was a cotton gin, mostly quiet now, and a stretch of red dirt road that turned to soup in the rains. And there was the one-room school, painted the color of old cream, with a bell on a post out front that Verna rang herself every morning at 8. She had 26 children in that room. Some barefoot, some in shoes handed down through 3 older brothers. She taught them all in the same 40 feet, the little ones up front sounding out their letters, the big ones in the back at their sums. And Verna moving between them like a woman crossing a creek on stones. She was 34 years old. She wore 2 dresses, turn and turn about, a gray one and a blue one, and she mended both of them at the same seams over and over until the thread showed lighter than the cloth. She boarded with a widow named Mrs. Alcott in a room off the back with a slant ceiling and 1 window. For that room and 2 meals she paid what a country teacher could pay, which was not much. She kept her own coffee tin, she darned her own stockings by the same lamp she read by. And she was, by every account in that county, a poor woman. Poor in money. That part was true, and everybody knew it, and I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later more than anything else in this story. Here is the thing nobody in Ashwater knew about Verna Sedgwick. In the bottom drawer of her school desk, under the chalk and the roll book, she kept the financial pages of a newspaper folded in quarters. Not this week's. Old ones. Whenever the mail brought a paper with the market columns in it, she cut those columns out and folded them away in that drawer. If you'd asked her why, she'd have looked up mild as milk and said it was an old habit. Just an old habit. And she'd have gone back to grading slates and you'd have forgotten you asked. She did not tell people about her father. There was no reason to. But I'll tell you. Because you need to know it to understand the woman. When Verna was 12 years old, back in Ohio, her father had been a man of some property. Not rich. Comfortable, he owned a feed business and a good house, and he believed a printed thing was a true thing. Because it was printed. A company came through selling railroad bonds. Guaranteed, they said. 8%, they said, backed by iron and by land, and by the sure future of the nation. Her father bought them with everything he had, and then he borrowed against the house and bought more. And the railroad was track laid over nothing, a line of stakes in a field that never carried a single car. The men who sold it were 3 states away before the first payment came due. Verna stood beside her mother at the auction of their house. She was 12. She watched strangers carry out her father's chair and her mother's good dishes and the bed she'd been born in. And while the auctioneer talked, a clerk from the bank stood near her with the papers on a board, adding the columns, and Verna watched over his arm. She watched every figure. She saw how the numbers on the bond had never once matched the numbers the land could earn, not from the first day, and how any soul who'd added the two together would have known. Her father hadn't added them. He'd only read the pretty part and believed it. She taught herself to read a balance sheet standing at that auction. 12 years old. That is where it started. She never forgot how it felt to watch the bed go out the door. She promised herself, in the plain way children promise things, that she would never again be lied to by a column of numbers. And she never was. So that was the woman ringing the school bell in Ashwater in the spring of 1925. A poor teacher in a mended dress who could read a ledger the way the preacher reads scripture, and who kept that fact folded away in a drawer like a thing to be ashamed of. Let me show you why the children loved her. Because the town would forget it soon enough, and I don't want you to. There was a boy that spring named Tomlin Reese. 9 years old, thin as a fence rail, the youngest of a family that farmed 40 poor acres out past the branch. Tomlin came to school with an overdue slate. That is, the slate the school lent him had cracked across the corner, and by the rule of the county the family owed a dime to replace it. And the Reeses did not have a dime to spare that they weren't already spending twice. Tomlin came in one morning with his head down and his ears red, because he knew about the dime, and he knew his people couldn't pay it, and he thought he'd be sent home. Verna took the cracked slate, she turned it over in her hands, and she said, loud enough for the room to hear, that this slate was not broken at all, it was only improved, because now a boy could tell his own by feel in the dark. She said the county owed the Reeses a thank you for finding the flaw in county slates. And she set it back in front of him and told him to get to his sums. At noon that same day she saw that Tomlin had no lunch. Not a cold biscuit, not a strip of dried apple. Nothing. His people had sent him with nothing, because there was nothing to send. Verna had brought her own dinner in a tin, a piece of cornbread and a small cold sweet potato which was most of what she'd eat till supper. She set the tin on Tomlin's desk without a word about it, said she'd eaten too heavy at Mrs. Alcott's and couldn't finish, and went and stood by the window looking out at the road while the boy ate. She did that more than once, more than a dozen times. And on those days she walked home hungry and mended her gray dress by the lamp and never said a word to a living soul. That was Verna Sedgwick. Remember her. The town's about to forget. It was a Saturday in that same spring when the shine came to Ashwater. That's the only word for it. A motor car, a real one, came bouncing up the red road and stopped in front of the general store, and out of it stepped a man in a cream-colored suit and two-toned shoes, with a leather case in his hand and a smile that reached both his ears. Sherrod Pyle. He had come up from the coast, from where the whole state had gone money-mad that year, and he had come to Ashwater to make every soul in it rich. You have to understand what Florida was in 1925. The whole peninsula was a fever. Land that had been worthless scrub was selling and reselling, sometimes 3 times in a week, each time for more. And men who'd never owned a suit were carrying deeds to Gulf lots they'd never laid eyes on. The papers were full of it. Cities rising out of the mangroves, fortunes made on a signature. And the fever had come inland at last, up the county roads, to little farm towns like Ashwater, where $1 was still a hard thing to come by. Pyle brought it in his leather case. He sat up on the store porch. He opened the case. Inside were prospectuses, printed handsome on heavy paper, and a map with a blue gulf and green streets and lots laid out in neat squares, with names like Meridian Heights and Palm Vista, and a subscription book bound in red. The Gulf Meridian Land and Development Company, he told them. Gulf View acreage, subdivided and ready. $10 a share. And here Pyle would drop his voice like a man telling a secret to a friend. $10 now, but doubling by Christmas. Every share, doubled, guaranteed by the land itself and by the surest boom the good Lord ever sent a working man. They gathered around him like children around a candy jar. Farmers who'd come in for nails and salt. The blacksmith. 2 deacons. Old men who'd never held stock in anything. And Pyle worked them slow and warm, reading out the dividend the company promised, a fat number, a number that made men lick their lips, and pointing at the blue Gulf on his pretty map, and telling each of them by name that he'd hate to see a neighbor miss the thing that was going to remake this whole county. Verna was in the store that day for thread. She stood back by the dry goods and she watched and she listened, and something in her went cold and quiet, the way it had gone quiet once at an auction in Ohio. She knew the shape of this. She'd known it before Pyle finished his first sentence. But she held her tongue, because it was not her business, and she was a poor woman with no money in it and no standing to speak. Then Marcus Threadgill asked to see the prospectus, and Threadgill was the chairman of the school board, so he was near enough to Verna, and when he'd looked his fill, he set it down on the counter by her elbow. And Verna, God help her, looked at it. She couldn't not. It was a printed column of numbers, and her eye went to it the way a thirsty man's goes to water. She read the promised dividend. She read the description of the land, the acreage, the lots. And she did in her head, in about 4 seconds, the same sum she'd learned to do at 12. What the land could earn against what the company swore to pay. And they did not match. They came nowhere close to matching. The dividend Gulf Meridian promised on a $10 share was more than the whole described acreage could bring in rent in a year, even if every lot rented at once, which they could not, because half of them, by the prospectus's own map and its own fine print, sat below the tide line. Swamp, they were selling squares of water and calling them Gulf View. Verna heard her own voice before she'd rightly decided to speak. Quiet, even, she said the numbers didn't add. She said the promised dividend was larger than any rent this land could ever earn, and that a company can only pay out what it takes in, and this one promised to pay out what it could not take in, and there was only one place money like that comes from the next man's $10. And when there's no next man, she said, it stops. The porch went quiet for a breath. Just a breath. And then Sherrod Pyle laughed, easy and kind. The way you laugh at a child who's said something bright, and he turned that laugh into a knife without ever changing his smile. Schoolteachers, he said, teach children their letters, ma'am. He let it sit. They don't read a grown man's ledger. And the whole store laughed with him. Every man on that porch. Threadgill loudest of all, because he'd handed her the paper and felt the fool for it. They laughed her right back into the shadows by the dry goods, and Pyle turned again to his red book, and the pens came out, and Verna Sedgwick paid for her thread and walked out past all of them into the road. 31 men signed that afternoon. She counted them without meaning to. 31. $10 a share, and most of them buying more than one. Pyle drove off in his motorcar at dusk with a case full of money and a promise to come again in a month, and Ashwater talked of nothing else at every supper table that night. Nothing but the doubling. Nothing but Christmas. Verna walked home the long way, past the school, and let herself in and sat at her desk in the empty room in the last of the light. She took out the folded newspaper columns from the bottom drawer, old habit, and she read the market figures she'd read 100 times, and she did not know yet what she was going to do. She only knew what she'd seen. She'd seen the railroad bonds again. She'd seen her father's auction coming up the county road in a cream-colored suit, and she'd seen 31 of her neighbors sign their names to it and laugh at her for saying so. Now I want you to understand something about being right too early. It is the loneliest thing there is. Because nothing has happened yet. The shares don't fall the next morning to prove you. They rise. And every day they rise, you look a little more foolish, and the loud man looks a little more like a prophet, and the longer reality takes to arrive, the more the crowd is sure it's never coming. Verna knew that too. She'd have to live inside it a good while yet. The month turned, and Pyle came back, and the shares had not doubled, but they had climbed. Word had run down from the coast that Gulf Meridian was up 12, then 15, and a man in Ashwater who'd put in $10 in the spring could tell himself he'd made 5 just by breathing. That did more than any speech Pyle could give. That was the fever doing its own selling. And this time Pyle didn't set up on the store porch. This time they gave him the church basement because the crowd had grown too big for the porch and because giving a thing the church made it holy. They lit the lamps in the basement of the white church and the whole neighborhood came, wives and all, and children on the stairs. And Sherrod Pyle stood up front where the Sunday school teacher usually stood, and he told them the boom had only just begun. He read the new price. He passed the pretty map hand to hand. And then Marcus Threadgill stood up. Threadgill was the biggest man in that room, in land and in loudness both. He owned 200 acres free and clear, left him by his father. And he was chairman of the school board and a deacon of that very church, and he had decided, he told them, that a man who believed in a thing ought to believe with everything he had. He announced, standing there under the lamps, that he had that very week gone to the bank in the county seat and mortgaged his farm. His paid-for farm. And with the money he was buying 400 shares of Gulf Meridian land in development. 400. $4,000 borrowed against the dirt his father died on. The basement roared. They came up and shook his hand. Here was a man with the courage of his convictions. Here was a leader. Here was the future of the county standing in $200 of new boots. And in the noise of it, Threadgill's eye found Verna Sedgwick where she sat near the back. Because she had come, she'd made herself come, and something in his blood was still sore from the store porch a month gone. He raised his hand for quiet, and he got it. And he looked right at her, and he made her the lesson. He said there were timid souls even in a bold county. He said some folks would rather warn than build. And then he said the thing they'd repeat for weeks. He said her caution was the timidity of a woman who's never earned a dollar she didn't beg from this board. The whole congregation applauded. That's the part I need you to feel. Not just laughed. This time. Applauded, grown men and women, in the basement of a church. Clapping their hands at a poor woman being told she begged for her bread. And the ones nearest her, who'd sat by her, they turned in their seats. They turned their backs to her and faced Threadgill and clapped. She sat in a little island of turned backs with the lamplight on all their shoulders. Verna did not answer him. There was no answer that room would hear. She gathered her shawl and she stood, quiet as she could, and she went up the basement stairs and out into the dark, and behind her the applause went right on for Marcus Threadgill and his 400 shares, and nobody but the children on the stairs even watched her go. She walked home in the dark. It was a mile and a piece and the road was black under the trees, and she walked it with her arms crossed over her chest. Not crying. Verna was not a crier, but hollowed out in that particular way that being mocked for telling the truth hollows a person. She thought about her father. She thought about the bed going out the door. She thought that she had tried, at the store and now at the church, and both times they had laughed her back into the dark, and that maybe the kindest thing was to hush now and mind her 26 children and let the grown men ruin themselves as grown men will. But she didn't hush. She got to Mrs. Alcott's and she lit her lamp and she took out the Gulf Meridian prospectus, her own copy. That she'd paid Pyle a nickel for that first day because she wanted to read the fine print at her own table. And she opened it to that one page. And she found the figure. The promised dividend, the number that could not be paid, the number that was the whole lie in one place. And she took up her pencil and she drew a circle around it. And then, slow, pressing harder, she drew the circle again. Twice around. A ring you could feel on the back of the page with your thumb. She sat and looked at it a long while. That circled number was the first move she made that wasn't just words in a crowded room. It was quiet. Nobody saw it. But it was the beginning of something, and she knew it was. And she folded the prospectus with the pencil mark inside and put it under her Bible on the shelf, and blew out the lamp, and lay a long time awake. Now the shares kept climbing, and here is where being right became a kind of daily wound. by high summer Gulf Meridian was quoted at $22 a share. 22. A man who'd put in his 10 in the spring had more than doubled, exactly as Pyle had sworn, and so as far as Ashwater could see. Pyle had told them God's own truth, and the schoolteacher had told them nonsense. The proof was in the paper. $22. What could a mended dress say to $22? And the town, having laughed at her, now did something worse. It pitied her. That was harder to bear than the laughing. Women who'd turned their backs in the church basement now stopped Verna on the store porch and were kind to her, in that soft, terrible way, and told her they understood. Some folks just weren't made for taking chances, and wasn't it a mercy she had her little school? They pitied her for being poor while they got rich. They bought her silence with sympathy. And Verna took it, and said thank you, and went on, because what else was there? Threadgill drove past the school one afternoon in a hired car with his new watch chain across his belly, and he tipped his hat to her. Gracious as a lord to a beggar, because a winning man can afford to be gentle to the one he beat. Pyle came a third time, and there wasn't a soul in the county who'd hear a word against him. The whole of Ashwater was long on Gulf Meridian and rising, and every rise dug Verna's error deeper, or what they were all certain was her error. And she stopped being talked about at all, which is its own kind of loneliness, to have been so wrong you're not even worth mocking anymore. It was in the thick of that summer that Emmett Doyle began to come around. Emmett was a farmer out on the West Road, 38, a widower these 4 years since the fever took his wife. He'd been to France in the war, in the mud and the wire, and come home with a limp in cold weather and a quiet that some folks took for hardness but wasn't. He worked 90 acres alone, and somewhere across 2 winters of church suppers and school programs, he had come to look at Verna Sedgwick the way a man looks at the one window with a light in it, and that summer he started finding reasons to be on the town road when school let out, so he could walk her a piece toward Mrs. Alcott's. They were an easy pair. He didn't talk much and she didn't need him to, and they'd walk the red road in the long light and he'd carry whatever she was carrying, and they'd say ordinary things. The weather, the children, a mare he was thinking of buying. He never once mentioned the shares to her. That was his gift. In a summer when it was all anyone mentioned. He knew she'd been laughed at, and he never made her stand near it. Verna, who had guarded herself since she was 12, found that she looked forward to the road with Emmett Doyle more than she'd have told anyone alive. But the fever had its hand even on Emmett. One evening near dusk, at the turn where the road bent toward the widows, he stopped and turned his hat in his hands the way a man does when he's rehearsed a thing, and he told her something he'd been carrying. He had, he said, his bonus from the army. The soldier's bonus the government had paid the men who'd gone over. $340, kept back all this while in a coffee can under a board in his barn. Money he'd never touched because he'd never had a reason big enough. And he was thinking, he said, and his ears went red like Tomlin Reese's, he was thinking of putting it into Gulf Meridian. All of it. Because a man who wanted to come to a woman with something, a future, a real offer, needed more than 90 acres and a limp. He wanted to come to her, he said, with something. Verna stood very still in the road. And I want you to sit with what she felt. Because it was 2 things at once, and they were tearing at each other. Here was the one person in the county who'd been kind to her without pity, offering to ruin himself for love of her. And she knew, the way she knew her own name, exactly what would happen to that $340. She knew Emmett Doyle's coffee can was already gone the moment he signed Pyle's red book, though not one soul in Ashwater would have believed her. And she did a thing she had never done for anyone. She told him about her father. She stood in the road in the last light and she told Emmett Doyle, out loud, the first time she'd said it aloud to another living person, about Ohio. About the railroad bonds guaranteed at 8%, backed by iron and by land. About her father borrowing against the house to buy more. About the track that was only stakes in a field. She told him about the auction. About standing beside her mother at 12 years old and watching strangers carry the bed out the door. about the bank clerk with the papers on a board, and how she'd stood at his elbow and learned to read a column of figures because she never again wanted to be the person who didn't. Her voice didn't shake. It was worse than shaking. It was flat and low and sure. The voice of a thing worn smooth from being carried a long time in the dark. And then she said the only thing she'd say against his plan. She said, "Emmett, the Gulf Meridian dividend is bigger than the land can earn." It was the same in Ohio. That's the whole of it. When a paper promises to pay more than the thing beneath it can make, the money's coming from the next man's pocket, and it stops the day there's no next man, and it always, always stops. Keep your can under the board. Come to me with nothing. I never wanted the something. Emmett Doyle looked at her a long moment in the dusk, and he didn't laugh, and he didn't pity her, and that alone near broke her. He said he'd think on it. That's all. He put his hat back on and walked her the rest of the way in silence and left her at Mrs. Alcott's gate and went home to his 90 acres and his coffee can. And Verna didn't know, walking up the widow's steps, what he would do. She wouldn't know for a good while. That was another loop she'd have to carry, wondering, in the nights. By late summer the shares stood higher still, and Verna made her first real move. She had 6 families she loved. Not the whole county. She couldn't save the whole county and had stopped trying. But 6. The Reeses, Tomlin's people, out past the branch. A war widow named Delia Cobb, whose husband hadn't come home from France and who lived on a small pension and a smaller garden. Old Mr. and Mrs. Yandell, who'd fed her that first hungry winter. 3 more like them. Poor families. Families that could not afford to lose $10, let alone borrow to lose $40, and every one of them had begun to talk about scraping together a stake for Gulf Meridian. Because everyone was. Because how do you watch your neighbors double their money and not reach for it yourself? Verna did not stand up in any meeting. She'd learned what standing up in meetings got her. Instead, at her lamp, over 3 long nights, she copied out the arithmetic in her own hand, plain as she could make it. 6 copies, 1 for each family. Not a sermon, just the numbers. Here is what the share costs. Here is what the company swears to pay you. Here is what the land it's built on could earn at the very most, and here is where you can read that in their own prospectus. In their own fine print, on this page. And here is the difference between the two. Which is the money that isn't there, which is the money that comes from the next man until there is no next man. She wrote it out 6 times by hand, and she signed none of them. She left her name off every one. And on a Sunday when she knew the families were at church, Verna Sedgwick walked the county roads alone in the heat, mile after mile, and she laid a folded paper on each of 6 porches, waited with a stone against the wind, and turned and walked away before anyone came home. No name, no note but the numbers. She didn't want thanks, and she didn't want the fight that thanks would start. She only wanted 6 families to have the truth in their hands where nobody could laugh it out of them, to read alone by their own lamps, and to do with it what they would. That was all she thought she could do. Leave the arithmetic and walk away. She told herself that was the end of it, that she'd done her part. 6 porches. And now she'd tend her school and let the county go where it was bound to go. But it was not the end of it. Because the shares kept climbing, and by the turn toward autumn Gulf Meridian stood at $38, and now it was not just farmers and deacons. Now the bank itself in the county seat was taking Gulf Meridian shares as collateral against loans, writing them down in its books as good as land, as good as gold, and when the bank does that, the last wall is gone. When the bank believes, there's no one left to disbelieve but a poor schoolteacher in a mended dress that the whole county had already laughed at twice. And Verna, sitting at her lamp one night in the first cool of the year, with the crickets loud and the town asleep and certain of its fortune, took down the prospectus from under her Bible. The one with the numbers circled twice in pencil, the ring you could feel with your thumb. She looked at it a long, long while. Then she got out a clean sheet of paper. and she began to write a letter. Not to a neighbor, not to Pyle, not to Threadgill, not to anyone in Ashwater who would only laugh. She wrote, in her plain, careful hand, to the office of the state comptroller in Tallahassee. And she asked them one question, a single quiet question about how the Gulf Meridian Land and Development Company had been incorporated, and against what, and by whom. That was all. One question, from a nobody, mailed into the dark. She folded her letter around the pencil-marked prospectus, the number circled twice inside it, and she sealed the envelope and she wrote out the address by lamplight. And she told no one. Not Emmett. Not Mrs. Alcott. Not a soul in that county knew that on a cool night in the fall of 1925. While the whole of Ashwater slept dreaming it was rich, the schoolteacher they'd mocked had quietly dropped a lit match down the one crack nobody else had thought to look for. She set the letter by the door to carry to the store in the morning, where the mail went out. And she blew out the lamp. And she lay in the dark and listened to the crickets. And she did not know if that letter would ever be answered or read or anything at all. She only knew she'd sent it. It would go unanswered for a long time. Long enough that she'd near forget she'd sent it. Long enough that things in Ashwater would get worse for Verna Sedgwick, much worse, before that envelope in Tallahassee was ever opened by the one man in the world who'd know exactly what her circled number meant. The letter went out the next morning, tucked in with the mail at the store, and nobody noticed. Why would they? It was just a schoolteacher's envelope, plain, no return but her name. Verna handed it across the counter to the boy sorting the sacks, and she paid her penny, and she walked out into a town that was busy getting rich. And it did get rich. On paper. The shares climbed. That fall they crossed $40. And men who'd never had two coins to rub together talked about mortgages the way other men talked about weather. Easy, certain a thing that came and went and always came back around. Marcus Threadgill ordered himself a motor car out of a catalog in Jacksonville. A real one, brass and black, with a horn that played two notes. He talked about it at the store like the county owed it to him. Sherrod Pyle stayed on through the harvest. He didn't have to sell anymore. People came to him now, hats in their hands, asking could they get in before Christmas, before the price ran clean away from them. He'd lean back on his stool by the red subscription book and let them wait. He liked the waiting. He liked how it looked. And Verna. Verna kept teaching. She heard the talk. You couldn't not hear it. It came in the door with the children in the mornings, all their father's certainty parroted back in little voices. Tomlin Reese told her his daddy said they'd have shoes for everybody by spring. She just smiled at that and set him to his sums. What was there to say? She'd said it. She'd said it at the counter and she'd said it in the church basement. And they'd laughed her out both times. So she stopped saying it. She only watched, and she waited on an answer that didn't come. Weeks went by. The envelope in Tallahassee might as well have fallen down a well. She near forgot she'd sent it. A letter from a nobody, into the dark, and the dark had swallowed it whole. Then the board turned on her. It was Threadgill who moved it. Of course it was. A December evening, cold for Florida, the board met in the schoolhouse she'd swept clean that afternoon, and Marcus Threadgill stood up at her own front table with his thumbs in his vest and said the county needed a teacher who believed in it. We've got a woman here, he said, who stands up in a house of worship and tells her neighbors they're fools. Who talks down the very prosperity that's putting a roof on this school. What's she teaching those children? Doubt, sourness. I'll not have my boy taught to spit on his father's good fortune. Verna sat in a child's seat at the side of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She'd worn her better dress. Both her dresses were mended, but this was the one with the fewer mends. She listened to the man tell the room she was poison, and she did not say a word. Emmett Doyle was there. He'd come, quiet, in the back. She felt him more than saw him. And she waited to see what he'd do, and the waiting hurt worse than Threadgill's mouth did. He didn't stand up for her. Not that night. He sat there with his hat turning slow in his hands. And when the vote came to consider not renewing the schoolteacher's contract in the spring, Emmett Doyle looked at the floor. He didn't raise his hand against her. But he didn't raise his voice for her either. And in a small room, silence is a kind of answer. The motion carried to be taken up in the new year. Threadgill sat down well pleased. Verna walked home alone in the dark, the way she had before, past houses lit warm and certain of their money. Mrs. Alcott had left a lamp burning for her. Verna came in and hung her shawl and sat at the little table, and for the first time in all of it, for the very first time, her hands shook. Not from fear. She'd have told you it wasn't fear. It was the plain loneliness of being right in a room that hated you for it. She was 34 years old. She had 2 dresses and a shelf of books and a letter gone silent in a state capital, and the town she'd tried to save was fixing to put her out on the road. The shares hit $54 that same week. 54. From 10. 5 times over and climbing, and every soul in Ashwater who'd bought was a paper king, and the one woman who'd said stop was about to lose the only work she had. If you'd walked into that town in the middle of December of 1925 and asked who the fool was, they'd have pointed at Verna Sedgwick without a breath of hesitation. She had never looked so wrong in all her life. Emmett came to her the next evening. He stood on Mrs. Alcott's porch with his hat off, and his face was a misery. "I should have spoke," he said, "in there. I should have spoke and I didn't." "No," she said. "You shouldn't have. It wouldn't have changed the vote. It would only have cost you your standing, too, and you've a farm to think of." "That's a coward's arithmetic." "It's just arithmetic, Emmett." She almost smiled. "I do it out of habit." He turned his hat around one full time. "I near put the bonus in," he said. "Did you know that? The 340. I had the form filled. Pyle had my name half in the red book." He looked up at her. "The night you told me about your daddy. The auction. Standing there a girl reading the numbers off a man's ruin while they sold your beds out from under you. I went home and I took my form out of Pyle's book and I put my money back in the can under the barn board. And I've felt like a fool every day since, watching it hit 54. "You're not a fool," Verna said. "Everybody says I am. Everybody but you." "Then keep the company you trust," she said, "and count the rest out." He stayed a while on the porch. They didn't say much more. But when he left he took her hand, just for a moment, rough and warm, and he said, "I'll not touch that money. Whatever comes. You've my word." And she believed him, and it was the one good thing in a bad month. Christmas came. The shares held near their peak, and the whole county spent money it did not have on money it did not really own, and Verna marked a small quiet holiday with Mrs. Alcott and a hen, and she waited on spring and the axe of the board. The wire came in the second week of January. It came to the telegraph office in the county seat, and it came up the road to Ashwater by noon. And by the time it reached the store, it had already changed the color of every face it passed. Gulf Meridian Land and Development had missed its August dividend, had been missing it, quiet, while the paper still traded. And now, past covering, past pretending, the company had defaulted outright. Its Miami office was dark. Its officers could not be found. By nightfall the shares were worth nothing. Not 54. Not 10. Not a dime. There was no man in Florida who would give you a nickel for a share of Gulf Meridian, because there was no man in Florida who did not now know what Verna Sedgwick had known at a store counter in the fall. The land was swamp. The lots were under tide line. The dividends had never been real. It was paper over water, and the water had come up. The panic rolled through Ashwater farm to farm like a grass fire. It hit the store first. Men crowded in and shoved the red subscription book across the counter at nobody, because Pyle was gone. He'd left in the night. His rented office over the feed store stood padlocked, and word was his commission money had gone north weeks back ahead of the wire, which told its own story about what he'd known and when. It hit the bank next. The bank had taken shares as collateral on 100 loans, had held them proud as gold, and now the gold was gone and the loans were bad, and the bank pulled its neck in and froze. No more lending. Calling what it could. And what it called first, hardest, was the biggest debt on its books. Marcus Threadgill's. He'd mortgaged 90 acres of good farm for 400 shares. 400 shares now worth exactly nothing. And the mortgage did not care that the shares were worthless. The mortgage wanted its money, 8% and the principal, and Marcus Threadgill did not have it and could not get it, because the thing he'd borrowed against had turned to swamp gas in a single afternoon. His farm was posted for auction inside the month. The motor car sat in his yard, brass and black, 2 notes on the horn, and there was talk the bank would take that too. Verna heard it all the way you hear a storm you saw building. Without surprise. Without any joy in it either, and that surprised the ones who watched her, because they'd braced for her to crow. She didn't. She stood in the store the day after the wire, buying her flour like always, and the men who'd laughed her out into the road that fall stood around the cold stove and could not look at her. One of them, old Purvis who farmed the creek bottom, finally said it. "You told us, Miss Verna." "I did," she said. And she counted out her coins and she took her flour and she went home. That was all. No speech. She'd used up her speeches back when they might have done some good. But it wasn't over. The town knowing she'd been right in its bones was one thing. The town knowing it in the eyes of the law was another, and that came near a month later, on a gray morning, up the road in a state car. Verna was at the blackboard when the children saw it through the window. A motor car, a stranger, a man in a town suit with a leather case. Tomlin Reese near fell out of his seat. Nobody in Ashwater dressed like that. Verna set down her chalk. He knocked on the schoolhouse door mid-lesson, which no grown man had ever done, and he took off his hat when she opened it. He was younger than she'd have guessed. Tired around the eyes. "Miss Verna Sedgwick?" "I am." "My name's not going to mean anything to you," he said. "I'm a deputy examiner out of the State Bank Examiner's office." Tallahassee, he glanced past her at the room full of children gone dead silent. "Ma'am, I wonder could I have a few minutes of your time? It's about a letter." She let the children out early. There wasn't a one of them who wouldn't run straight home with it anyway. And she stood the examiner at her own desk, the plain scarred desk where she'd taught her sums for 4 years. And he opened his leather case. He took out a report, pages of it, typed, official, a seal at the top. And he laid it on her desk. And then he did a thing that stopped her breath. He reached back in the case and he took out her prospectus. The Gulf Meridian prospectus. The very one. She knew it by the fold, by the wear, and by the number circled twice in pencil. The ring you could feel with your thumb. He set it down beside his report. "This came to the comptroller's office in the fall," he said. Enclosed in a letter. One question about how Gulf Meridian was incorporated, and against what, and by whom. He looked at her. "It sat a long while, ma'am. I won't lie to you. We're a small office and there were a great many companies, and yours was one quiet letter in a very tall stack. I'm sorry for that. If we'd opened it in September, some of what happened here might not have." Verna looked at the prospectus. Her own pencil, months old. "When I did open it," the examiner said, "I read your question and I looked at the figure you'd marked. This one." He touched the circled number. The promised dividend set against the acreage described. "And I did the same piece of arithmetic you'd already done. That the dividend they were paying could not come off that land in 100 years, because half those lots were below the tide line and the other half was cypress swamp." He tapped his report. "That's what this says. Gulf Meridian was watered stock over lots that could not earn $1. Incorporated to fail. Set up to sell paper and collapse, and the men who ran it are wanted in 3 states." The schoolroom was very quiet. Chalk dust hung in the slant light from the window. "The figure my office flagged," the examiner said, "the one that broke the whole thing open for us, is this figure. The one you marked. In pencil." 8 months before we did." He straightened up, and he looked at her plain, one careful reader to another. "Ma'am, you had this 8 months before we did." Verna Sedgwick looked at the report, and at her own pencil ring beside it, and she did not weep, and she did not gloat. She had waited a long time in the dark for this, longer than she'd let herself feel. She only nodded. Once, the way you nod when a thing you always knew is finally, at last, allowed to be true out loud. "Would you read that?" she said, "where the town can hear it?" The examiner read it at the store. He read it at the same counter where Pyle had laughed her out into the road, in front of near the same crowd, because a crowd will always come when there's news. He stood at the counter with his official pages, and he read the state's finding out in a flat, clear voice, and the men of Ashwater took off their hats and stood and listened, and not one of them laughed. Gulf Meridian land and development, watered stock. Swamp lots below tide line. Dividends never earned, never earnable. A company built to fail. And named in it, named as a defendant to answer in absentia, wanted for the selling of it, Sherrod Pyle, sales agent. When the examiner said Pyle's name, a low sound went through the store. Not surprise. Just the sound men make when the last thing they'd hoped wasn't true turns out to be true after all. Old Purvis was there. He looked over at Verna, who stood by the flour sacks where she always stood, and he said, loud enough for the room, "She read us that same paper right here. Right at this counter. And we run her off." Nobody answered him. There wasn't an answer. The examiner folded his report and put it away. Verna didn't say a word in that store. She'd said her words already, months back, to a laughing room. She didn't need to say them again to a silent one. But there was a place she did have words for, and that was the board. The school board met in her schoolhouse, same as always, to take up at last the motion to put her out. Only the room was different now. Threadgill's chair sat empty a long while before he came. When he did come, he came changed. His farm was posted. 90 acres, the house his father built, the motor car, all of it going under the auctioneer's hammer inside the fortnight. The bank had called every dollar, and he had none. The man who'd stood at her table and called her the timidity of a woman who'd never earned a dollar she didn't beg was ruined down to his boots, and he knew every soul in the room knew it. He couldn't look at her. He sat at the table where he'd humiliated her, and he stared at the wood grain, and when the chairman's business came round to the schoolteacher's contract. Marcus Threadgill said one dry sentence, so low they had to lean to hear it. "I withdraw my motion," he said. "And I've no more to say to this board." That was all, no apology. Pride can't shape one. He'd have choked on the word sorry. But he withdrew it, and he sat there hollow, and the whole table looked at Verna Sedgwick to see would she take her turn now. Would she stand and give the man back an ounce of what he'd handed her in front of the congregation? She'd earned it. The whole county would have cheered her for it. She didn't. She stood up, and she smoothed the mended front of her better dress, and she spoke to the board plain and even. "I'll not talk about who was right," she said. "That's done. And it did nobody any good, being right, least of all me." She looked around the table. "But I'll ask you something. This winter, I'd like to teach the older boys their bookkeeping. Real bookkeeping, how a ledger's kept and how it's cooked. How to read a printed prospectus and find the lie folded inside it. So that the next Sherrod Pyle who comes up this road with a leather case and a red book finds a county full of people who can read his numbers back to him." She paused. "So this doesn't happen to Ashwater twice." The board sat quiet. Threadgill's head was down. "Will you let me teach them that?" she said. They let her. Of course they let her. There wasn't a man at that table with the face to tell her no. And so Verna kept her school. But that was never the sweetest part, and if you followed her this far you know it. The sweetest part was the 6 families. They came to her one by one, that hard winter, quiet, the way you come to somebody you owe a thing you can't quite name. And each one of them brought a piece of paper. Her paper. The unsigned arithmetic sheets she'd copied out longhand by lamplight and left weighted with stones on 6 poor porches in the fall, with never her name on a one of them. They'd kept them. The Reese family kept theirs. Tomlin's daddy, who worked 40 poor acres and had wanted so bad to buy in, showed her the sheet in her own careful hand, folded soft from being folded so many times. I couldn't make heads nor tails of who left it, he said. But it was numbers, and it was plain, and it scared me honest. We didn't buy. We've still got the 40 acres. Ain't much, but it's ours. They didn't buy. They kept their farms. Every one of the 6. Poor as dirt, all of them. The families with the least to lose and the least they could bear to lose it, and every one of them still had their land when the smoke cleared. Because a schoolteacher had done their arithmetic for them in the dark and asked nothing, not even to be known for it. The last of the 6 was Delia Cobb. Verna went to her, out past the creek, a small poor place. Delia Cobb was a war widow. Her man had gone to France in the Great War and hadn't come home from it, and she lived on a pension that came the same small amount every month, whether the world was booming or busting. She'd wanted to grow that pension. She'd wanted it bad, a widow alone, and Pyle had told her the shares would double it by Christmas. She stood in her doorway, and she showed Verna the arithmetic sheet. I had the money set out, Delia said. On the table. For Mr. Pyle, then this come on my porch under a rock, and I couldn't read half the words, but I could read the numbers. And something in me said hold. So I held. Her voice went thin. My pension's all I've got in this world, Miss Verna. It's my herald, still looking after me from over there. And I near handed it to a swindler. She looked up. It was you, wasn't it? On the porch. It was your hand. It doesn't matter whose hand it was, Verna said. It matters to me. Delia Cobb took Verna's 2 hands in hers. You kept my herald's pension in my pocket, and you never asked me to know it. There's not many would do a kindness they couldn't get thanked for. Verna didn't have an answer for that either. She just held the widow's hands a moment. And then she walked home in the winter light, past the auction sign on Threadgill's 90 acres, and she didn't feel like a fool anymore. She'd near forgotten what it felt like, not being the county fool. It felt like nothing much. It felt like a quiet Tuesday, which is the truest kind of vindication there is. And Emmett Doyle came to her at the end of that winter, and he came the way he'd said he wanted to, back when the shares were climbing and he was tempted half out of his mind. He'd said he wanted to come to her with something. To have something to offer so a good woman wouldn't be marrying into nothing. He came to her with the same $340 he'd started with. Not doubled. Not multiplied. Not turned to swamp gas like every other man's money in the county. The same soldier's bonus, whole. In the same coffee can he'd pried up from under the barn board, because he'd taken his name out of Pyle's red book the night she told him about her father's auction, and he'd never put it back. He set the can on Mrs. Alcott's table. The lid was rusted. Inside was every bill he'd earned bleeding in France. I meant to come to you rich, he said. Everybody was fixing to be rich. And instead, here I am with the same money the army gave me, and not a penny more. He looked half ashamed and half like a man who'd walked out of a burning building. But I've still got it. And I've still got the farm, which is more than any man who called me a fool this winter can say. It's more than most, Verna said. It's yours if you'll have it, he said. The farm, and the fool, and the coffee can. All 3. He turned his hat around one time. The old nervous circle. I'd not have kept $1 of it without you. I'd have followed the whole county straight down the tide line and never known why the water was rising. Verna Sedgwick looked at the rusted can on the widow's table, and at the man who'd kept his word through the worst temptation the county ever put to him, and she said yes. Plain and quiet, the way she said everything. She said yes. The arrogant fell before the same eyes that watched them rise. The worthy kept what they'd earned. And a careful reader who'd been laughed out into the road stood at the end of it with her school, her honor, and a good man's whole heart in a rusted coffee can. That's most of the story. There's a little more. The next autumn, if you'd walked past the one-room school in Ashwater of an afternoon, you'd have seen a strange thing pinned to the wall behind the teacher's desk. Not a map. Not the alphabet. A printed prospectus, worn soft, with a number circled twice in pencil. The Gulf Meridian pages, saved, framed by 4 tacks, hung where every child could see them. It was the lesson. Verna taught the older boys to read it. She'd stand at the board with the chalk dust hanging in the slant light, and she'd walk them through it line by line. Here's what they promised. Here's what the land could earn. Here's the space between the two. And in that space, boys, is where the lie always lives. Learn to see that space. Measure it. And no man with a leather case will ever put his hand in your pocket again. Tomlin Reese sat in the front row. 9 years old that first winter, 10 now, and he could already tell a real dividend from a swindles, which was more than any grown man in the county could have done 2 years before. His people still had their 40 acres. He came to school in his own shoes. Out at the road, when the light went gold in the late day, you'd sometimes see a farmer mending the schoolyard fence. Emmett Doyle, driving a nail slow and careful, in no hurry, a man tending a thing that was his to tend. And the 2 men who'd laughed the loudest. Sherrod Pyle you never saw at all. There was a wanted notice on the post outside the general store. His name on it. Fading in the sun and the rain through that whole year, curling at the corners till it was near unreadable. He'd gone north with his commission, and the law was still looking. And folks said it always would be, and that was the last Ashwater ever had of Sherrod Pyle. A name peeling off a post nobody troubled to replace. Marcus Threadgill you did see. Once in a while. He'd lost the 90 acres at auction, the house and the motorcar with it, and a man from the next county bought the land and rented some of it back to Threadgill to work. So he farmed his own father's ground now as a tenant, hat in hand on the first of the month. He came to the school door one gray day. Verna was alone, sweeping up after the children. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his 2 hands, the way he'd stood at the board when he withdrew his motion, and he didn't come in. "They tell me," he said, rough, "you're teaching the boys to read those papers now. So it don't happen again." "I am," she said. He nodded at the floor. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said the only thing pride would let him say, which wasn't sorry, but was as close as a man like that ever gets. "Teach 'em good," Marcus Threadgill said. And he put his hat on, and he walked back to the acres that used to be his. Verna watched him go up the road. She didn't feel triumph. She'd stopped waiting for triumph to feel like anything. She only turned back to her sweeping, and the chalk dust turned gold in the slant of the window light. And out at the fence Emmett drove another slow nail, and the school was warm and quiet and full of children who could read the space where the lie lives. A greedy crowd sees the price. A careful eye sees the paper underneath it. Ashwater learned the difference the hard way, one auction sign at a time, and the woman who'd tried to teach it to them gently, for free, in the fall, was the same woman teaching it to their children now, and would be for a long while yet. She kept the prospectus on the wall the rest of her days, the number circled twice, the ring you could feel with your thumb. A lit match, she'd once thought of it, dropped down the one crack nobody else had looked for. But it wasn't a match, in the end. It was a lamp, and it burned in that little schoolroom long after the men who'd laughed were gone, teaching every child who came through the door the one plain thing the whole rich county had forgotten. Do the arithmetic, then decide what to believe. If you're still with me, wherever you're watching from tonight, comment the name of your town below. I'd truly like to see how far Verna's story has traveled.